everybody. Welcome to episode 11 of CFL Trade. My name is Robert Dalton, co-host of the Rouge Radio podcast, and I'm a Bomber fan. You can even call me a homer. Yeah. Why is this important? Because in the last couple of days and a couple of weeks, to be honest with you, I've been inundated with emails, tweets, comments saying that I'm too much of a homer, that I can't be impartial by saying that the Bombers can't be subject to a bad trade. I've shown previous trade trees where they've actually been the beneficial of a great trade and therefore a great trade tree. I beg to differ because a couple of episodes ago I dictated that the Bombers screwed up by trading up to pick Tyson Pencer. That wasn't great. So I decided to honor the obligation by proving my impartiality by trying to find a bad Bomber trade, or a bad trade tree, to be honest. And while it's possible that there is a bad trade, it's very tough to find a bad trade tree because, well, finding a bad trade tree from a bad trade is like finding a needle in a haystack, because every team in every GM regime has had a head scratcher of a trade. Case in point, the Tyson Pencer selection. The problem is that maybe you start to look for a bad trade tree from a good trade.
Had to search the bowels of hell, but I found someone.
Yeah, that was kind of weird. But the creepy Bert guy is right. I did find one. And for context, let's go to this week's trade tree. Yeah. Alright, so context here, okay? Let's go back to 2006. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers became the first team to dive into free agent frenzy at 12:01 in the morning, because 12:01 in the morning was when the free agent frenzy hit. Can you imagine if CFL insiders now actually had to set their alarm to scroll through Twitter at 11:45? Alright, this guy signed, this guy signed. Oh, okay. Someone signed. And they fell asleep 45 minutes later because the other 8 GMs actually didn't bother to wake up. That's how I imagine everything would work out. Case in point, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers signed star linebacker Baron Simpson, cornerstone of that defense for the next 3 years. Actually, they nicknamed that defense the Triangle of Terror, and their linebacker moved 2 defensive tackles, being Ron Warner and Doug Brown. Hey, and 9-9 is not a great, but compared to the year before that when they finished 5-13 and making the playoffs for the first time in 3 years, I'd call that a win-win for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. 2007, they went one better. They went 10-7-1 and won the first 2 playoff games before losing in the Grey Cup to the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Great. In 2008, well, they just managed to re-sign a lot of those returning players and re-sign a new defensive back by the name of Javon Johnson. You're thinking, oh, everything's coming up Millhouse. And then injuries happen. Kevin Glenn's not finding his rhythm. Steele misses the first 4 games. Baron Simpson is lost for the season. Well, they had a backup linebacker, the stud by the name of Joe Lovendon, and he was very good. And he got injured. So, as with every good GM, Brendan Taman had some options. You could go to your most recent draft pick, Pierre-Luc Labbé. Not going to happen. Or you could sign a free agent, which there wasn't any at this point. So, your only option is to reach out for a trade. So, Brendan Taman gets onto the phone with Bob Abilovich in Hamilton and says, hey, we want that guy. And Bob says, well, what guy? Well, Zeke Moreno, because we need a linebacker. Bob says, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. We want Tom Canada. And the deal is struck. It's 1-for-1, Zeke Moreno to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and Tom Canada to the Hamilton Tiger Cats. But wait. I don't know if it's a condition on every trade, but Tom Canada had a physical, and it turns out that he had a busted spleen. What's going to happen? Well, Brendan Taman was actually in desperation mode because Zeke Moreno had actually just gone to the airport and flew to Winnipeg the moment that he found out he was traded. And they were in desperation mode, like I mentioned, and Bob Abilovich said, hey, listen, we really need some people. We don't want anybody else on your roster that you're not willing to give out, so we'll take a first-round pick in 2009 and rights to Corey Mace. And Brendan Taman said, hey, so we don't have to actually give up anybody on the roster? Great, done deal. So the trade is actually, let's scratch this out, Zeke Moreno to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in exchange for the first round pick in 2009, which ended up being 3rd overall, and the rights to defensive tackle Corey Mace. We'll get on the Hamilton side of things, but let's go to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers side. And his Winnipeg debut was actually pretty monumental, not necessarily for the stats, because there's a lot of things happening in that game. There was a forced fumble, resulted in a touchdown, but that's not it. He added 5 tackles to that game. The Bombers beat the Argonauts 39-9. Why I remember that? Well, because it was also the game that the Bombers and Argos dressed in their 50s retro. It was also the game that Milt Stegall broke the most yardage per career, breaking Alan Pitt's previous record. And it was also the game that Don Matthews returned to the sideline for the Toronto Argonauts, going 0-8 the rest of the way. Argo fans don't want to remember that. Going throughout the rest of the way, Zeke Moreno did not help the Winnipeg Blue Bombers get to the Grey Cup. In fact, they went one and done. Taman Barry gone. In comes Mike Kelly and John Murphy into the fold, and Zeke Moreno gets traded to the Toronto Argonauts in exchange for defensive end Real Johnson. Now, Mike Kelly and John Murphy get their share of flack for their roles in 2009 and their 7-11 record for that year, most notably because of how they handled the media. Their trades and recruiting were top-notch, including this trade. Listen, Barron Simpson coming back, Joe Lobanon coming back, you didn't need 3 linebackers. I mean, sure, Dalts good, but you don't need them. And to get a prominent pass rusher in the fold who's Canadian to boot, Mike Kelly and John Murphy nailed this trade. Now, let's go forward into 2009. Further into that, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers pull up a blockbuster deal that acquired future Hall of Famer Odell Willis. They didn't need a defensive end anymore. They had Fred Perry, Gavin Walls was on his way out. They didn't really need Real Johnson, but who needs a good Canadian pass rusher, right? Yeah, okay, so that's part of the flack that Mike Kelly should get. Real Johnson packaged with Sean Main sent to the Montreal Alouettes in exchange for quarterback Ricky Sanchez. Okay, not bad, good prospect. But with Mike Kelly and John Murphy on their way out after the 2009 season, Joe Mack and Paul Appley said any stench of Mike Kelly has got to go, and Ricky Sanchez gets released and strides on with the Montreal Alouettes. All right, so that's the end of the Winnipeg side of things. Let's go to the Hamilton side of things, all right? The 3rd overall pick was traded to the BC Lions in exchange for the 6th and 13th overall pick in 2009. And off chance comment here, the BC Lions used that 3rd overall pick to select running back Jamal Lee. And it's okay, career special teams prominent. Nothing wrong with that, but didn't get the opportunities, and why bother, because there's a guy by the name of Andrew Harris in BC. That's 13th overall selection, though, and that Hamilton took. They used that to select defensive back Ryan Hines. Great selection, probably one of the most underrated selections of this draft for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Back in 2012, though, they let him go to free agency, and he signed on with the Edmonton Football Club, therefore signifying the end of that ranch. The 6th overall pick was selected to use fullback Darcy Brown. It's an okay selection, not the best. I probably would have switched selections there, Ryan Hines and Darcy Brown, back and forth, whatever. It might not have been available, but it worked out well for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Darcy Brown not putting up the numbers, although that has probably predominantly due to the offense that Marcel Belfay runs, and you can't fault him for that. He does get traded to the Edmonton Football Club in 2012 in exchange for a conditional 6th-round pick in 2015 and defensive back Ricardo Colclough. The 6th-round pick in 2015 ends up being defensive tackle Everett Ellison. Stayed around with Hamilton for a couple of years in the practice roster, hasn't come to fruition, and that's the end of that one. Ricardo Colclough, though, had a couple of interceptions, a couple of good games for tackles for the rest of the 2012 season. He went south after the 2012 season to play in the AFL. That ends with that one. All right, so let's go to Corey Mace. Corey Mace was in the contract negotiations with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Because he was a 2nd-round pick, Hamilton was playing hardball, saying, hey, we're going to give you $65,000, which is on par with what 2nd-round picks get. The only issue is that Corey Mace had already had a smell and sniff of the NFL at this point. Getting more on the practice roster in the NFL said, nope, not going to do it. And so the Hamilton Tiger Cats said, well, we don't want this headache. We're going to ship you and a 3rd-round pick in 2010 to the Toronto Argonauts. And we're going to get a different headache in the form of Arlen Bruce III. More on that in a little bit. Corey Mace doesn't play for the Toronto Argonauts. In 2010, Corey Mace gets traded to the Calgary Stampeders in exchange for defensive back Tristan Black. So if you're following along, Corey Mace does not play for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, does not play for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and does not play for the Toronto Argonauts. But he finally puts pen to paper and signs with the Calgary Stampeders, having a very good career. However, injuries got the best of him and he retired after the 2015 season. He's currently with the organization as their defensive lineman coach. A third round pick though, well, if you follow through this trade tree episodic program that we have, you would know that this selection was as part of the Kerry Joseph saga in episode 3. I'm not going to go through the whole selections and whatnot, but this pick was actually packaged with a bunch of other draft picks and sent to the BC Lions. The Toronto Argonauts ended up getting selections to use to select players like Corey Greenwood, Spencer Watt, and Joel Reinders. The BC Lions didn't get this probably good enough players like that, but they did come out of it with receiver Akeem Foster. Great player, great depth player, and a reliable receiver and Canadian to boot. Let's go to Arlen Bruce. In 2011, Arlen Bruce wore out his welcome in Hamilton and was traded to the BC Lions in exchange for a conditional pick in the third round in 2012. That pick was actually used to select defensive tackle Michael Atkinson, who had played a couple of seasons and was very good in rotation alongside that D-line in Hamilton before being released a couple of years later. So, if you're following along and keeping tabs, throughout the 50 months that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers participated in this trade tree, they got 57 tackles, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble, and 2 touchdowns, and one of them was from Real Johnson on a short yardage play. And in doing so, they provided the BC Lions an opportunity to gather the following weapons: Jamal Lee, a couple of special teams players, Akeem Foster, and Arlen Bruce III in capturing the 2011 Grey Cup in BC. Why is that a big deal? Because in doing so, the BC Lions defeated the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in capturing said 99th Grey Cup. And that is how you have the worst trade tree in Blue Bomber history. Listen, injuries happen, and you can't fault Brendan Taman at all for doing what he did. He didn't give up a roster player, and it hurts that he had to give up a first-round pick in 2009, but you had to do what you had to do. But if you had a gun to my head and said that in doing this trade, you're going to provide an opportunity to one team to gather all these weapons to beat you in the Grey Cup 3 years later, I would have called you nuts. Well, nuts in 2020 is reality, and for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, that can be said the same thing in 2011. That'll do it for this week's trade tree. If you like what you saw, if you thought that I missed something, please hit the comments below and suggest anything. And of course, if you like what you saw and you want to follow and get more content, hit the subscribe button. We're always looking for more content on this YouTube channel. And if you have any further trade tree suggestions, hit me up on Twitter at Rouge Dalts. My podcast can be found at Rouge Radio. And of course, this video is powered by the Canadian Football Podcast Network. Follow that CF Pod Network on Twitter.